Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, hello, welcome. I'm Sherilyn and I'm so glad you found me. If you're not new here, welcome back to our True Crime Wine Wednesday. Hey, if you like wine, into true crime, love hanging out amongst friends, then you should definitely hit that subscribe button. I think it's here. Is it here? Is it here? It's either here or here. The point is, you should locate it, give it a little clickaroo so that you can join us here every Wednesday. And you don't have to drink wine. Perhaps you like the greener side of life. Maybe you're just more of a coffee or tea person. It's just like an iced water with a little splash of lemon individual. Like whatever you are into, we accept. And we'd love to have you a part of this incredible community and this channel. All right, let's get into today's video. Grab your drinks, grab your snacks, grab your viewing partner. I just wanted to give a shout out to one of our viewers named Sarah who left a comment for me the other day and it just melted my heart. She said that her and her mom always watched the videos together, and I just can't tell you how much it means to me when I see things like that, and it puts into perspective that like you guys are like just hanging out with me, with your family or your friends. Like I can't tell you how cool it is to hear those things. Remember when I just had a hair stuck to my face? How long was that there for? Whew. Anyways, you guys are the best. I'm so blessed to have you. Thank you for inviting me in your homes and hanging out with me every Wednesday, you guys. All right, let's get started before I just like jump through the screen and squish you all. Today's case is part 1 of 2. I will let you know in advance it is a heavy one because it's a crime that involved children. And I don't usually cover them on my channel because they are so hard to do. But this case I've been wanting to do for a really long time, specifically because it's the first case I got really invested in when I first saw it like 12 years ago. It really consumed me, and it turned me into somebody who for the first time like spoke openly and shared with like friends and stuff that I was such a true crime junkie. And this case particular just opened my eyes to how flawed the system can be because of the injustice that happened. Not only for the 3 precious boys who lost their lives, but for an additional 3 because of what I believe was a modern day witch hunt for a crime they didn't commit. In my opinion, there have definitely been suspects out there that have far more evidence pointing towards them as possibly being involved than these 3 ever had. But because of the size of egos in this case, I really found out that somebody's life could just be put on the line, and that finding true justice does not mean a single thing when people are caught up having dick swimming competitions. And that's really unsettling. Almost as unsettling as me using dick swinging competitions as a reference right now. Who am I? If you've never heard of this case, it's most commonly known as the West Memphis 3. It took place in West Memphis, Arkansas on the evening of May 5th, 1993, when 3 8-year-old boys went missing from their home after they were out riding their bikes together. Less than 24 hours later, every parent's worst nightmare came true when the bodies of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers were found in a creek nearby. They were found within a wooded area close by, and it was obvious upon finding them that they were victims of a gruesome attack. I won't be going into horrifying details, but there are some that I will share just for the purpose of showing how evidence was taken and manipulated to look one way when it was actually another to send these 3 boys that were accused of doing this crime to jail. We'll get into that a little bit later. Right now, I want to share more about the victims and the timeline that led up to finding them. Stevie, Christopher, and Michael were neighborhood friends. They grew up in an area that was like a family area, but it wasn't like bougie or anything like that. It sounded more of like a middle-class family area. And then there was also some lower income housing within the vicinity. It sounds a lot like the area I grew up in, actually, and I'm sure many of you did as well. And the boys sound like a lot of the little guys that were in my area as well. Steve Branch, whose nickname was Stevie, he was the son to Steve and Pamela Branch. His mom and dad were divorced when he was just a baby, though, and for about a year it was just him and Pamela, and she was really, really close with her son. She was awarded sole custody, so they had a lot of time in that year that they were just the two of them to bond and form a really, really tight connection. Not too long after she divorces Stevie's dad, she remarries a man named Terry Hobbs, and he becomes Stevie's stepdad, and the two of them have a daughter together named Amanda. I read that Stevie was really proud to be a big brother, and he just sounded like a great kid all around. At school, he was an honor student. He loved Cub Scouts, and he always was down to meet up with his little buddies in the area and go bike riding for as long as he could after school. His friend Christopher Byers grew up very similarly. He was born to his mom Melissa Defer and his dad Rick Murray. Kind of sounds like a disc jockey name, Rick Murray. I don't know if he was a disc jockey. His parents ended up divorcing, and Melissa remarried when he was 4 years old. She married a man named John Mark Byers, and he adopted Christopher. So Christopher ended up taking his last name, thus becoming Christopher Byers. Chris also gained a stepbrother in this marriage. He was 13 and his name was Sean. Christopher also was your typical 8-year-old boy, loved getting out there, getting dirty, playing with his friends, was a bit of a daredevil, still believed in the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus. Apologies if all of a sudden now things look really different. I just filmed another half an hour of this and my camera didn't record any of it. It actually just deleted it all on its own. So we're going all the way back to pretty much the beginning. The third little boy was named Michael Moore, and he was the son of Todd and Dana Moore, who also had a daughter named Dawn that was a year older than Michael. Michael was considered the leader of the pack. He had the type of personality that was very assertive, wasn't afraid to tell you if he liked or disliked something. He just had strong leadership skills, and I think he gained them in his love for Cub Scouts. He was a hardcore lover of the club and often was seen wearing the uniform even on days where they didn't have meetings. In fact, he was actually wearing his uniform the day that he went missing. That day was a typical day for all of them. They started it by going to school. They were all in grade 2, and grade 2 was strengthening those math skills. You started getting to do funner things at gym class, just ripping it up at recess with your friends. It was just the best. Stevie's mom said she picked him up after school at 2:30 like she did every day. They walked home like they always did, and she said that Stevie looked up to her and said, "I love you, Mommy," about 100 times like he always did every day. When they get home, she asks him if he's got any homework, and he says he doesn't and that he finished it all in school earlier. And so when his friend Michael comes around at about 3:30, he's hoping that he's going to be able to go and play with him. Stevie's mom had to work that night though. She had a serving job at a local restaurant, and she was in the middle of trying to get dinner organized for the kids, tidy up the house. So initially she said no, he couldn't go and play, and boys being boys, or kids being kids in general, I was guilty for this. I'm still guilty for this. Can't take no for an answer. They're like, "Come on, please, please." They're pressing her, and she just caves, and she's like, "Okay, you can go, but you have to be back by 4:30. About 5 minutes after they leave, Christopher Byers comes calling on Stevie to see if he can play, and his mom's like, "You know what? You literally just missed him. You probably crossed paths and didn't even realize it. If you go out there, you'll be able to find them." She gets back to doing what she's doing around the house, and then at about 4:15, her husband Terry comes home. Stevie's supposed to be home in 15 minutes, but by 4:45, he still hasn't arrived for supper. But they're not too concerned. This is the early 90s. We didn't have cell phones at this time. A lot of kids didn't even wear watches, so you were left to rely on your friends or popping in people's houses to be like, "Hey, Mrs. Smith, can you please tell me when it's 4:30 so I can go home?" I mean, it was not uncommon to miss your curfew. The good old days. So she's used to this, and she's got to get to her shift, so she just asked Terry to take her to her job, and this is around 5 o'clock. I'm not too sure if Stevie did end up going home and checking in and realized his mom had already left and took that as, "I'm going to go back out," but we do know he was seen around 5:30 with the two other boys. At one point, they were also seen with another boy who was a little bit older than them in the area. And then around 6, it was, again, just the 3 of them. When they were seen at 6 o'clock, it was actually Chris's father who saw them. And he sees his son on a skateboard. But he's on, like, his stomach on the skateboard. And he's riding down the middle of the road on it. So he calls him in and he's like, "What the heck are you doing?" He gives him a spank on his butt. And he's like, "You can't do stuff like that. It's super dangerous." I just realized my mic was like all the way across the room, so I'm really sorry that the audio there for a couple of minutes was probably really shitty, but we're back in business. I'm having a time today. So Chris's dad gives him a swat on the butt, and he tells him, if you want to go back and play with your friends, you've got to clean the carport up. But he doesn't stick around to see if he does it. He's actually got to go pick up his older son at the courthouse who's arguing like a traffic ticket over there. And it's Chris's mom, Melissa, who remembers seeing him still in the carport around 5:45, but then she doesn't see him again after that. Next, it's around 6:30 that the boys are spotted again, and this is by one of the neighbors of Stevie Branch, and she says she's on her way to church, and she sees the boys ride past them, and then sees up the sidewalk Terry Hobbs calling for Stevie to come home. Next, closer to around 7 o'clock, they're seen again. All 3 boys are together. This time, they're headed in the vicinity of Robin Hood Hills. This was like one of those wooded areas. I feel like a lot of areas have these. I grew up with one close by my house. It was where like the teens went to like drink and smoke and have privacy, and then the little kids would go there with their bikes, or they would like hike along the trails and try to find like abandoned tree houses and stuff like that. So that's what this area was. It wasn't far from home. It was just up behind the interstate, and it was next to a truck stop. Now by the time the boys were seen headed that way, it's around 7 o'clock and it's already starting to get dark out. By this time, Chris's adoptive father has now already made it back home, and he's starting to get worried that he hasn't seen his son yet. He's already given him heck earlier, so he doesn't think that he'd be like rocking the boat too much, and that he would make an effort to get home if he could. So he calls the police and reports him missing. A description is given of all 3 boys. They say Stevie was last seen wearing denim jeans and a white t-shirt. He was also riding his black and red bicycle. Christopher was also seen wearing blue jeans and a long-sleeved white t-shirt. Michael was last seen wearing dark blue pants, his Cub Scout of America shirt. Is it Cub Scout of America? Boy Scout of America? I always get like Boy Scout, Cub Scout mixed up because I know one is like, I think Canadian and one American. Maybe they're both the same in both. Anyways, he was wearing his uniform, and he was also wearing his orange and blue hat that was part of his uniform, and riding his light green bicycle. I don't know why light green was so hard to get out. Police arrive at the Byers household, and by this time, family and friends are there, and people among the neighborhood that are trying to help as much as they can by giving information of like at what point they saw the boys throughout the evening. But I mean, everybody's in a scramble. Like the only thing they want to do is just like hit the canvas, get out there and start looking for them. So they're not really establishing like a concrete timeline. Poor Stevie's mom, she doesn't even know what's going on. She ends up getting picked up from her shift at about 9:15, and Terry doesn't tell her anything. She sees like what's kind of going on in the neighborhood, and she's like, "What's going on?" and looks at their daughter, and she's like, "Where's Stevie?" And Amanda just tells her, "We can't find him." She obviously gets out and joins the search, and everybody in the area is searching all night. They're focusing primarily in that area of the neighborhood, but they do make their way over to Robin Hood Hills, but they don't come up with anything. The next morning, when they have daylight helping them, they call in some more resources. They do another scan of the entire neighborhood, and they also go back to Robin Hood Hills. This time, though, they formed like a human chain so that they could like cover more ground and make sure that they weren't like missing anything, nothing was getting overlooked, and it wasn't like people were going over the same spot twice and like missing others. Again, though, they don't come up with anything. It's not until that afternoon at around 1:45 when a juvenile corrections officer is patrolling the area. He calls in and talks to dispatch. He's like, "Hey, like what's happening today?" And she lets him know that there's a search going for these 3 young boys, so he decides he's going to join it as well. So he's driving around and looking, and he said for some reason Robin Hood Hills just pops into his head, so he makes his way over there, and he's searching for quite a while. and he looks into the creek and he sees just a single shoe that looks like it belongs to a little boy. He doesn't go down by himself. He actually calls for more officers to join him. One of the officers goes into the creek to retrieve the shoe, and as he's in there, he says that his foot gets caught up on what he thinks is a log underneath the water, and it actually makes him like trip back, and as he trips back, this log comes up with him, but it wasn't a log, it was actually the body of one of the boys, and it's just across his lap. It's just awful. Like I said, I'm not going to go into detail. If you are curious about it, there's a lot of information online that you can see for yourself. For purposes of the case though, and why it took the direction that it did, I will say that all 3 boys were found hog-tied without their clothes, submerged in water, and it appeared that they had cuts on their bodies. Specifically, one of them having cuts in a specific private region. Because of the condition of their bodies and the fact that West Memphis is known for being a very God-fearing town, immediately the suspicion is that a cult has to be related to the crimes. So huge buzz starts going around the town. Everybody's talking that this was because of some satanic ritual that was performed. And in this situation, I mean, it's really easy to see where you just want to go to Satan, because who in the world could do something like this to children? So because of this, the direction that it took in the investigation led the police to source out a cult specialist that they had within the force. I didn't even know this was a thing. Pretty much, he said that he was just somebody who read a lot on cults just so that he could better understand them, and that because of this, it made him an expert in other officers' eyes. The first thing they did was pull names of people that lived in the area who would fit the description of like a cult member and who had had previous run-ins with the law. The first name that he comes up with is an 18-year-old named Damien Eccles, and in his opinion, he was the perfect candidate for being a cult member because, among other things in this town, if you didn't look normal or didn't fit in, you immediately stood out. And this was Damien. He was super angsty. He liked Metallica. He wore black all the time. Because of that, there's no other option. They don't think anybody else in the town could be responsible except for him. But they do think that he had help. Remember, this was a really gruesome crime, so they don't think that he was able to carry it out by himself. So they look to his circle and they set their eyes on his best friend, who is a 16-year-old named Jason Baldwin, and an acquaintance of theirs, a 17-year-old named Jessie Miss Kelly. Damien and Jason were really close. They were actually inseparable and grew up in that friendship like brothers pretty much. They were basically living together because if they weren't at one person's house for a sleepover, they were at the others. They shared clothes. They loved to listen to heavy metal together. Jason was a little bit different than Damien. He was very artistic. He did well in school, had high grades. He actually excelled in art so much so that pretty much all of his teachers were really, really pushing him to pursue graphic design when he got to college. That being said, he and Damien weren't Boy Scouts. They did have their struggles. They were both actually in trouble with the law for vandalism and theft. It was actually just months before the murders that Damien had his last run-in with the law when he and his girlfriend at the time were caught breaking into a trailer. Police did end up dropping the charges against his girlfriend, but Damien was charged with burglary in that incident. He also had spent some time in a mental health facility, and according to professionals had, quote, serious mental illness. They said he had auditory and visual hallucinations, disordered thought processes, substantial lack of insight, and chronic incapacitating mood swings. Incapacitating mood swings, that's actually a really accurate word, I feel like sometimes for me when I'm going through like a little bit of a rough patch there. I mean, nowadays we can talk about that kind of stuff and it's becoming more accepting. I mean, before you say anything, I know like we are really a long way from fully accepting mental illness, but in the 90s, like we weren't even close to where we are now. So these types of things led people to believe that you were pretty much beyond help if you had any form of disorder. They thought Damien wouldn't amount to much. On top of that, he grew up quite poor. His family lived in the trailer park. They had their share of visits from social workers. He was also a high school dropout, so he was definitely seen as a lost cause. Jessie Miskelly was also looked at very similarly to Damien in terms of not amounting to much in other people's opinions. He and his family also lived in the trailer park. He often got in trouble for fighting. And he also had an IQ of 72, which made it really hard for him to learn things in school. So his dad decided to make the decision to pull him out, making him a high school dropout essentially, but focusing on a trade that he could really hone in on and love, and taught him everything that he knew about mechanics, and Jessie took to it really well. Unfortunately, in other people's eyes though, that's not what was seen. He was just looked at as another dropout. Given all of these circumstances and their choice in clothes and music, the detectives are absolutely certain these three are involved and that Damien specifically is the leader of the pack. Since Jessie was known for never turning down from a fight, they looked at him like the muscle that Damien probably needed to control all of the children. And even though Jason wasn't known for being aggressive at all, they believed that under Damien's influence, he could never say no to him. They bring Damien in for questioning, but they do it under the guise that they need his help and don't leave him to believe that they suspect him of anything initially. And he seems willing to help. He goes in there and he shares with them who he believes they should be looking at, what type of person, not specifically a name. He said in his opinion, this was probably somebody who was very sick in the head and who did this for a thrill kill. Then he's kind of led to talk about how details of the crime could be led to Wicca, which is what he practiced, but it's not like they're leading him on to believe that this was a Wiccan thing. They ask him things like if the penis has any significant meaning. And they're trying to tie that in because they believe that the mutilation on one of the boys had to do with Wiccan symbolism. But Damien doesn't know that that's what they're doing. And he says to them that the penis means a symbol for power. They ask him then if there's anything to do with number 3, symbolizing 3 boys. And he said that it was a sacred number. And when he's asked if water has any significance, he says that water was a demonic symbol and that all people have a demon force within them. They're just eating this up. Everything that Damien is giving to them, in his opinion, to try to help, they're using against him. Then he's asked for an alibi and he tells detectives that he was with Jason for most of the day, as well as his girlfriend who was pregnant at the time. He told them they spent most of the afternoon at Jason's uncle's house playing video games. He then said he called his mom to pick up him and his girlfriend. By this point, the two of them had walked to a video store that wasn't too far away, so she comes and picks them up, drops off his girlfriend at her house, and then he joins his family at a family friend's house for a quick visit. He said they left there around 5 p.m. and all went home together, and then that's where he stayed for the rest of the night. And for the majority of the evening, he was talking to a friend of his that lived in Tennessee, so he was on a long distance call, which would have been easy to track by law enforcement if they had looked, but they didn't. He said the following day, May 6th, which was the day that the boys were found, he spent the day with his girlfriend. They asked him how he had heard about the missing boys being found, and he said that he had heard it from Jason late in that afternoon, maybe even early evening, and then he saw it on the news segment that played that evening. Next, he's given a polygraph, and he denies any involvement whatsoever, but they come back and they say that he showed deception throughout the whole thing. After they're done with Damien, they go to Jason, but unlike with Damien, his mother steps in and she refuses to allow her son to take a polygraph test. So they're only left to question him, and no matter how hard they try to get him to admit that Damien is involved in satanic cults and rituals, he will not budge, which leaves them to their last hope, which is to get some information out of Jessie Miskelly. They bring Jessie in and they question him for 12 hours without his parents, without a lawyer. He's asked asked about his alibi, he lets them know that earlier on in that afternoon, he was babysitting for a family friend. After he was done with that, he went on a walk with friends where he met up with several other people as they were crossing paths and shared with all of them that he wasn't able to meet up with them later that evening because he had a wrestling tournament that he had to go to in a town that was about 40 miles away. He said he went to the wrestling match and actually injured himself at it, which further proves he was where he said he was, and should have been enough evidence for the detectives to go and look back and just do some good old police work. But remember, Jessie has intellectual limitations, and part of that makes him very eager to please people, especially when he's under pressure and stress. He just wants it to stop, so he's willing to say and do what he needs to get himself out of that situation. I mean, when you are interrogated for an entire day, that can break anybody down, and eventually that happens to Jessie, and he starts forming a new story. Seeing his interrogation is absolutely infuriating. It's so obvious that he's being led to every single answer that he's being given. So he goes from sharing his alibi, which has nothing to do with even seeing Jason or Damien or the boys or being in that vicinity, to all of a sudden seeing Damien and Jason brutally kill the boys in front of him as a part of a satanic ritual. He then goes a step further by implicating himself having been involved by saying that he physically went and stopped Michael Moore from running away and held him down until Damien and Jason came to kill him, which, if you're just hearing his confession for the first time, would be really hard to listen to. The problem with his confession, though, is that every piece of information he was giving was inaccurate, so he was being led at each step to the correct answer. Initially, he says that he, Damien, and Jason found the 3 boys around noon. We know this is impossible because the boys were all at school, so without the detectives even acknowledging it, they just reply, "Oh, okay, so you saw them after school." And then he would agree, yes, after school. And then they took it a step farther. Later on in the conversation, he goes, "Okay, so yeah, when you saw the boys that evening." So now he's completely, again, just pretending that he never heard anything about after school or around noon. He's just like, "You guys saw him that evening." I mean, the whole entire confession is this way. It's just full of what the police had for evidence and then making it come out of Jessie's mouth. But in a way where they weren't like, "Okay, it couldn't have happened like that. It had to have happened in the evening." They would just like slip it in and then he would be agreeing to it. He also gave inaccurate information about the crime scene. When he was asked what was used to tie the boys, he said that they used rope, when in fact it was actually each of their shoelaces. None of this seems to matter, though. They have a signed confession from somebody who is willing to implicate himself and put the main character of the crime that they've been so thirsty for at the scene with them. And so on June 3rd, 1993, Damien, Jessie, and Jason were all arrested. Once they are arrested, the whole entire town goes ballistic. Literally, it was a modern day witch hunt. Burn them at the stake. Like, I really am surprised that nothing happened to them to and from the courthouse. And rumors start spreading like the freaking plague. It seems like every single person in this town now has like a story about these boys. One youth pastor was going around saying that Damien had told him he had sold his soul for a long time ago, so he could never be saved. Another rumor was going around that Michael Moore's testicles were found in a jar in Damien's house, which wasn't at all true, but it was coming from the mouths of the family members of the victims. So the assumption is that they were being fed that information by police, or that they had heard it and that police weren't denying it, so they were taking it as fact and spreading it further. The trials were actually separated into 2 trials. Jessie got to have his separated from Damien and Jason's because he had cooperated and given a confession. And because of that, it also meant that he was able to have it about 110 miles away from West Memphis. His trial starts on January 24th, 1994. At the trial, his lawyers share the alibi that he initially gave to detectives, but that was ripped apart. Despite that though, and witnesses coming forward that said they saw him at the wrestling match, the jury is just stuck on his confession, and they weren't able to see how he was manipulated and led to the confession that he made. So because of that, on February 4th, he is found guilty and he's sentenced to life in prison plus 40 years. 3 weeks after Jessie's convicted, Damien and Jason's trial starts, and they're tried together. This trial is one of those ones where when you watch it, you're sitting there screaming at your TV, and you know, like 1,000% you probably would have been kicked out of the courtroom because it would have been impossible to keep your mouth shut. Every single time the prosecutor talked, I was like,
"You're so dumb. You are really dumb. For real."
To me, he just reeked like a little worm. I felt it was so obvious that he was just grasping at straws and had absolutely nothing concrete. Not even because of like evidence or anything like that, just because of his presentation, his wormy little attitude. And deep down, it's pretty obvious that he knew he didn't really have anything and that he was just going to have to go rogue and lose all of his morals to make the case that he wanted to. Because before trial, they tried to offer Jessie a deal to testify against Damien and Jason. And this was done for 2 reasons. One being a testimony from somebody who was a witness, and there obviously would just be like an open and shut case. But number 2, without a testimony from him in court, they were unable to use his confession and that videotape confession. After prosecutors go to him with this deal, Jessie goes and talks to his family, and his family feels so strongly that he's innocent. Not only that he's innocent, but also Damien and Jason. So they tell him, you know, you're gonna have to do what you want to do, but just know we're going to be in that courtroom, and if you sit up there and you take the stand and you say that you saw Damien, saw Jason involved in this, and that you weren't involved with this, we know you're lying. So he turns the deal down. After he turns it down, they get so desperate that they offered Jason not 1 but 2 deals to testify that it was all Damien who did this. But he came back and he turned it down and he said no, because that would be a lie and I wasn't raised that way. Hearing that stuff really breaks your heart, because the 2 of them trusted that this is what a trial was for. They would go to court, they'd be found innocent, because if you didn't commit a crime, you weren't going to go to jail. Damien specifically went in with quite a bit of arrogance about him. He had that like cocky, angsty teenage air. There were many times throughout the trial where a witness would come forward and say that they had heard that Damien admitted he was involved, and he would just sit there and shake his head and like smirk and laugh because he knew they were lying. But to outsiders looking in, it just showed cockiness. It also looked a little bit intimidating and threatening. I mean, putting myself in his situation, especially at that age, I probably would have acted the same. You think that the jury is able to like see through these people like you are, but they're hearing this all for the first time. They have like no back context, because you can't stand up and say like this didn't happen. Jurors are also led to believe that if someone's an expert, they're to be trusted. And on the surface, when you're presented things the way they were, and you don't know what was going on behind the scenes, or that the trial was full of false evidence, staged scenes of discovering weapons, coerced testimonies, it's no surprise how at the end of this trial, Jason was sentenced to life and Damien was sentenced to death. And the jury believes they've done the right thing, but in reality, the only facts were that somebody was going to lose their life simply because they wore dark clothes, they liked Metallica, and they didn't fit in. These facts were hammered in the jury over and over and over again in the trial, and it proved that if you stood out in others' opinions for the wrong reasons, you would be so expendable that no matter how much real evidence pointed to anybody else but you, it didn't matter, and you'd lose your life because you were an individual who didn't look like everybody else. Heavy shit. That is it for me today, you guys. I will see you in part 2 of this case, where we will go through the evidence of the trial in detail and see how after all of these years, the whole satanic mutilation aspect of the trial that was pushed so hard might simply be explained by turtles, and how the knot in a shoelace may have the answer to who was responsible all along. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. You know it means the world to me. I love and I appreciate you so, so much. I will see you in part 2. I will miss you terribly until then. Make sure to love each other, love yourself, and I will see you soon. Bye.